And I really want to welcome you all to this webinar. It is one in a series of webinars that the PCC has been holding to discuss the work that it has been doing and the outcomes of the consultations on the inputs that it will make in relation to South Africa's 2035 nationally determined contribution. And in this webinar, we're going to talk about a means of implementation. I am shortly going to hand over to Lebogang Moloisi from the PCC, followed by Kwezikazi Windfull, to give some context and then to talk about the recommendations. And we are going to follow that by a panel discussion with some of the commissioners. And after that, we will have an open conversation with the participants on the webinar on the basis that this is all further input and feed in to the final recommendations that the PCC makes. So without further ado, can I please hand over to Lebogang to give some context and background. And then Kwezi, if you could come in straight after that, and followed by that, I'll come back and we will have the panel discussion and the facilitated conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Joanne. Thank you for facilitating this session on the means of implementation. Just to state that this session is the third of 3 thematic webinars that we have hosted, drilling down specifically on the recommendations that the PCC is proposing in terms of the nationally determined contributions for the period 2030 to 2035. This process has been very stakeholder intensive in nature, in the sense that the PCC had begun stakeholder consultations, beginning firstly with a capacity building session at the end of last year, and then the beginning of this year, getting stakeholder views in terms of what their contributions are and viewpoints are in terms of what should constitute the 2030 to 2035 update of the nationally determined contributions. We have supported this work with initial evidence-based modeling that has been intertwined into this process, coupled with the stakeholder views, which is culminated in the recommendations report that we are subjecting to public comment. That process is underway until the 23rd of June, where we have requested colleagues to provide their inputs in terms of the recommendations that we are putting forward. As I have stated earlier, this is the third of 3 thematic webinars. We started with the adaptation webinar last week. Yesterday was the mitigations webinar, and today is the webinar focusing on the recommendations for the means of implementation. And just to state that these recommendations are meant to guide the DFFE and provide input really as it updates South Africa's nationally determined contributions for 2030 to 2035. This process has been grounded in the principles of procedural, distributive, and restorative justice. These recommendations that we are presenting today on the means of implementation aim to align South Africa's international commitments with its they are grounded in principles of procedural justice and restorative justice, and they align South Africa's international commitments with domestic development priorities, legal obligations under the Climate Change Act, and pressing socio-economic imperatives. Setting an NDC requires dedicated resources, inclusive and whole of society engagement and consultation, better integration across the government departments, and alignment with the sectoral emissions targets, the low emissions development strategy. The sets and the LEDs are vital for shaping South Africa's future economy and should be treated as national priorities, especially when we take into consider future processes that will be open to the public for engagement. It is important for the updated NDC to reflect South Africa's evolving climate governance landscape. It must take into account the pace and affordability of the transition, considering energy security and sustainable economic growth. The PCC will be the first ones to admit that you can transition too quickly, but you can also transition too slowly, both cases having significant but different economic and social impacts. However, managed correctly, the NDC does present an opportunity to decarbonize existing sectors, gradually phasing out sectors that will cease to be more competitive, and also introducing sectors that will create opportunities for employment and poverty reduction. The Climate Change Act and the Just Transition Framework provide the legal and policy foundation for ensuring that a shift to a low-carbon economy is fair, inclusive, and supportive of vulnerable communities and workers. Given the escalating climate crises, trade and finance pressures, domestic inequalities, the 2030 to 2035 NDC update should reflect South Africa's just economic transformation. It must balance local realities with global expectations, clearly outlining policy intentions and assigned responsibility across the various spheres of government. Making a decision about an NDC is ultimately a political one. However, the Climate Change Act introduces a shift. The legally binding greenhouse gas emissions trajectory will be gazetted by the minister, with the NDC serving as a transparent communications instrument for domestic and international stakeholders. The existing body of evidence and research shows that a climate-compatible transition is both possible and desirable, but not everything can be modeled. We must pave the way for a just transition towards a low carbon and climate resilient society. The existing body of work by the ESRG in UCT, which we have relied a lot on for our, particularly our mitigation recommendations, suggests that a national carbon budget that ranges between 8 gigatons and 9 gigatons is a no-regret option, considering our fair share contribution as well as the economic benefits. Yesterday's discussion delved into the fact that economic benefit and decarbonization are not mutually exclusive. This represents a no-regret choice informed by updated national modeling consistent with the well below 2-degree pathway and remaining mindful of national capacity and economic recovery needs. All of this will require investment in renewable energy, infrastructure, grid upgrades, and storage to ensure energy security and our developmental needs. The direct investment in electricity infrastructure will create jobs and contribute towards GDP growth. Moreover, green industrialization and economic diversification should be prioritized through the development of green technology value chains. There are several upsides to a green industrial economy, including GDP growth, employment, and opportunities to finally tackle the stubborn levels of inequality in this country. In order to achieve this, the means of implementations must be strengthened through the integration of climate finance into South Africa's medium-term expenditure framework, mobilization of international concessional finance, and operationalization of domestic instruments such as the Just Transition Finance Mechanism and the Climate Change Response Fund. Strengthened delivery will also require urgent institutional support, particularly at the municipal level. This includes the strategic use of the climate capacity diagnosis and development tools, embedded technical assistance, support for project preparation and investment pipeline development, and alignment of sectoral master plans with climate priorities. With those opening remarks and framing, I'll hand over back to you, Chairperson. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lebo, for giving us that background and context. I think it frames it very well in the context of the overall socio-economic situation we find ourselves in, as well as the issues relating to justice. So thanks very much for that. I think that was very useful. I now want to call on Kwezikazi Vinful from the PCC Secretariat to present the PCC's draft recommendation on means of implementation. And then we'll go on to the panel discussion. Over to you, Kwezi.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning to everyone on the call. I'm just trying to share my screen. To let me know if and when you can see it.
It says you've started screen sharing, but oh yes, okay, it's coming up now. Needs to go on to full screen. Yeah, fabulous. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. So good morning, colleagues. Again, thank you to everyone who's made the time to join the call today. I will be taking you through the recommendations of the MOI chapter. To my colleague's point, Lebohang, we have been having a lot of conversation around the recommendations that the PCC is making towards the NDC process. And this is our final conversation, where we've had previous rich discussions on adaptation and mitigation over the last couple of days. So today, really, we are going to try to bring it all together because I think ultimately everything we've discussed, whether it's been our ambition on our emissions, our resilience to climate shocks, really does hinge on a couple of questions. Can we implement these recommendations? Can we finance them? Institutional capability, we are going to need to align our financing as well as really get to a level of genuine multi-level coordination. And this chapter aims to sort of try to paint a picture of how we can actually get this job done. So of course, we are not starting from a point of zero. I think we have made significant progress, but I think our challenges also do remain stark. We are dealing with fiscal constraints where public finances are really stretched, and that every rand that must be used, every rand that we receive as a country must be used to unlock broader value, whether it is by de-risking private capital or targeting public goods. We also have a challenge of institutional weakness, where especially at the municipal level, we are, and this is where we're going to be seeing a lot of the adaptation and infrastructure work sort of land. Our capacity gaps, within those subnational levels are well documented. And then finally, I think there is a challenge on access to finance, where we are starting to see an emergence of this global pool of climate finance. But we continue to underperform as a country, as a developing country, if I might add, to mobilize this finance. And often it is cited that this is because our pipelines are fragmented, our projects lack the proper preparation that's needed for financing, and then also just this issue around the perception of risk being too high, and a lot of countries similar to ours paying a certain risk premium in being able to access climate finance. And I think underpinning all of this is really the simple truth that our capacity and coordination are really going to be non-negotiable for us to be able to implement any of these MOI or means of implementation recommendations. So we've looked at what we actually need for us to be able to enable delivery. And at the very first instance, we speak about alignment, the fact that climate action must be fully integrated into mainstream planning and some of the national budgeting systems. So we speak about the expenditure frameworks, the Division of Revenue Acts, and some of the existing procurement guidelines. And that ultimately saying that climate really shouldn't be sitting on the sidelines of our fiscal planning. And then secondly, we speak about the strategic use of finance, where we're seeing a very limited, availability of public and concessional finance, and therefore having to think about how do we start using these funds to de-risk some of the sectors where markets are not going to readily go. And then thirdly, we look at the strengthening of institutions, where at local government level, especially, we are going to need to start embedding technical assistance as well as long-term capability planning and building.
Kwezi, your
Yes.
slides disappeared when we lost you for a minute. Can you reshare your slides?
Oh,
Thank
oh
you.
no. Okay. Please let me know if you are able to see them now.
Not yet.
And now?
I think it's coming up now. We can see a gray screen, but yes.
Yeah, they're back,
you proceed.
Kwezi.
Okay, so I'm not sure where you lost me, but I hope I was audible. Can I continue from where I was?
I think you must just continue from where you are, Kwezi.
Okay, thank you.
And the slides, I'm presuming, will be made available to everybody anyway.
They will, Chair. Thank you.
All
And then I was speaking about the need to strengthen our current institutions, especially at local government, and just really thinking about embedding technical assistance as well as long-term capability planning and building within these institutions. And then finally, how do we start activating market readiness in sectors that are going to enable us to be able to crowd in private sector capital? And here we speak about the scaling of green SMMEs, some innovation around Article 6 agreements, as well as other ecosystems around, things like carbon markets, right? And then as we move into the core recommendations, this is essentially what we've consolidated as what is going to constitute the core recommendations under the MOI chapter. And again, borrowing from some of the recommendations that have been made in the adaptation, as well as the mitigation recommendations. So we start off with some of the foundational enablers, where we speak about the need to legislate MOI instruments. So the Climate Change Act really being used to provide a legal basis for the means of implementation ecosystem, where we speak about these national delivery tools or instruments that we are seeing start to emerge in South Africa, like the JET funding platform, the JTFM, the CCRF, and some sectoral plans as well, and monitoring frameworks, and really trying to get to a point where there is this law that must be fully operationalized, that will carry with it accompanying regulations to make these instruments binding, enforceable, as well as predictable. And then we speak about the strengthening of adaptive social protection as another recommendation, and labor market reform. And here, having a focus on social safety nets that really must start evolving to meet climate shocks. And this includes strengthening of adaptive disaster response, How do we embed early warning systems? How do we scale social protection systems for vulnerable households? And how do we prioritize skilling, reskilling, and labor market transition support for workers that are affected and will be affected by decarbonization, especially in the high-risk regions within the country? There's a recommendation to develop a national loss and damage finance framework where South Africa must develop institutional mechanisms to quantify, attribute, and finance losses from climate disasters. And this includes embedding of disaster risk reduction principles, creating pre-agreed finance windows, and positioning for access to emerging international loss and damage mechanisms. We also have a recommendation to really start operationalizing some of these delivery mechanisms that we've spoken to, such as the CCRF, but also just the broader country platform architecture, where we need to start seeing the CCRF moving from this concept stage to a full operational status with a strong governance structure that can coordinate pipelines, that can blend finance across public, concessional, and private sources, as well as provide transparency to both domestic and international actors. And you will see that we make quite explicit recommendations around the CCRF because it is something that was announced, but also seeing the urgency of what we're dealing with in terms of climate disasters that have been happening around the country. And then we continue with additional enablers that strengthen our institutional readiness as well as integrate climate ambition to national fiscal management systems. And here a resounding sort of feedback to have a recommendation that speaks to the strengthening of our absorptive capacity across our delivery institutions. And here we speak about the need to, again, embed technical assistance at municipal and provincial levels, but also how do we start scaling project preparation facilities as a country and ensuring that institutions are equipped to absorb as well as deploy climate finance efficiently. We speak about finance sector specific adaptation targets as a recommendation. How do we use public and concessional finance to allocate it strategically to directly support adaptation goals across our priority sectors? So looking at sectors like water, agriculture, health, and disaster risk management. And just highlighting the fact that this targeted approach is going to ensure sector readiness for climate resilience. And then we speak about a recommendation around institutionalization of climate budget tagging and fiscal integration, where there's this need to have climate budget tagging frameworks formalized by the National Treasury and within the National Treasury systems, and really starting to link climate objectives directly to public expenditure planning, as well as enabling performance tracking of climate-related allocations across government budgets. We have a recommendation that speaks to the expansion of monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems, where there's a call to have robust MEL systems that are needed to track implementation progress, the outcomes of these implementation measures, and the lessons learned. And we believe that this will enhance transparency, accountability, as well as continuous improvement in our climate delivery efforts. And then finally, I think what we're finding sort of come through as core themes in our road to implementation of the means of implementation for the NDC is these three interdependent pillars, where there really does need to be a need to quantify the full investment need and this will help us to underpin this need and quantum into the fiscal coherence and be able to mobilize finance. there is this overarching need to really start thinking about how do we strengthen our absorptive capacity, so that our institutions across government are actually equipped to firstly absorb climate finance, but also be able to deliver on the means of implementation. And then finally, how do we advance a fully operational country platform that consolidates all these different and fragmented initiatives that we are currently seeing emerge, and really try to create a credible, a scalable, and a governance, a system that induces confidence in our government. Because I think ultimately we're going to find that implementation is going to be the true test of our ambition, and the world will ultimately measure us not by what we pledge or what we set as targets, but how we build, what we finance, and how we actually deliver on the ground. Thank you, Chair. I am going to stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, Kwesi. Thank you for taking us through that. We are now going to move on to the panel discussion. I'm just looking at what the time is. We're almost dead on time, so that's excellent. We have a panel that reflects the key constituencies, or some of the key constituencies that are represented in the PCC. In particular, we have reps from civil society, business, the faith communities, the youth constituency, and labor. And we are going to give each of the panelists 10 minutes to give us their views on the draft recommendation and on the approach that the PCC has taken. What I like about this approach in particular is how practical it is. So I'm also hoping that the panelists will talk very much about the specifics and whether you think those specifics are going to achieve the outcomes that we are looking for. I think that all too often we focus on the outcomes, but not necessarily on how we might get there. So from civil society, one of the panelists, Ms. Francesca de Casparis from the Southern African faith communities, is not available to be present in the webinar. And so she has done a taped input, which we will play, but we'll play it at the end of the panel. Everybody else is here, apart from the fact that Mbali Baduza could not be here, and so Brandon Abdenor, another one of the commissioners, will come in her place. So let me hand over to you, please, Brandon, to give your reflections on the presentation and on the approach of the recommendations. And I'm going to hope that all of you will stick to your 10-minute 10-minute time in order to be able to do that. So thanks for being here. Thanks for stepping in for Mbali, and over to you.
Thank you, Chair. A little unexpected, so I don't think I'm going to be using up my 10 minutes, but yeah, I do have some thoughts on this section, which I'm happy to share. I think this is obviously one of the tricky sections in an NDC, because the real elephant in the room is we need money and we need resources, and those are apparently in scarce supply. So I do think the creative way that this section has been unpacked and formulated is very well done. So some thoughts. I think it would be useful to allude to some degree to the eligibility of South Africa for climate finance and its attractiveness as a destination for climate-related investment. From a civil society perspective, we do believe that having sound ambition and demonstrating that, and demonstrating implementation as a country, rates us highly as a destination. We've obviously got the fundamentals in place in that our electricity system is relatively simple to decarbonize, not easy and not cheap, but it is low-hanging fruit in a way. So the inherent attractiveness is there. But I think it's important to keep exhibiting the right sort of ambition to remain attractive to initiatives like the JETP and others. Potentially a sensitive one, but I think worth linking the rollout of the Climate Change Act, for example, and the mechanisms in there with means of implementation. And that's coming from a perspective of understanding, there's a lot of chatter always, but that there are insufficient financial resources to roll out all of the mechanisms in the Climate Change Act. So I don't know if highlighting that in the NDC could potentially be useful. It's not a great thing to have to admit that as a country we don't have the money to do all we need to in terms of climate change response. But if that is in fact a factor, perhaps that should be highlighted. And then in general, we know that the funding that has been promised and that is needed from the global north just doesn't materialize. And I think the fight for that money is critically important to maintain. That is global climate justice. We need to keep the pressure on. We need to keep making those demands. But we also need to be working with a scenario where the money might not come, or it might come very slowly, or it might come in small amounts. It might come, way down the track. So what is it that we are going to do as a country to keep implementing as much as we can, notwithstanding that we're not getting the kind of financial flows that we need to see? So what can we do with existing budgets? Implementation, it needs money, but it's more than that. It's obviously capacity and technical support and know-how, which does exist within the ranks of the many experts in the country. So what could we do while we wait for the money from the global north? And again, that's not to say that the pressure must come off in any kind of way. I think that would show initiative. And I think send a powerful signal internally. At the end of the day, the NDC is our face to the world, but it's also an internal signal, and it gives those of us working within this space a North Star, if you like, and perhaps thinking of innovative ways to make do with what we have at the moment is something that could be very constructive. The draft talks about different stakeholders sort of supporting or being interested in different types of financial support. And it says that civil society, for example, is very keen on highly concessional loans and grants. And then it talks about business being in support of more conventional forms of finance, but on favorable terms. I don't think the business community also wouldn't prefer grants and highly concessional loans. So a small tweak there, but it's the way it's presented is a bit like it's a binary. In terms of the absorptive capacity that needs to be strengthened, I think perhaps having some sort of high-level examples of the ways in which that absorptive capacity is not adequate at this point in time might be useful, just to give us an idea of what it is that we are aiming at. Quite contentious, I'm sure, in some circles, but certainly our view that we need a much stronger carbon tax to act as an incentive, and perhaps leaving the door open for that level of fundraising should be there. We're seeing some states in the USA levying basically loss and damage levies onto big emitters. I think those are kind of creative ways in which we could move the money from where it is to where it needs to be. I think that perhaps could be an entire section or more focus on mainstreaming of climate response across organs of state and role players. In this section, I don't see Treasury tagging in this chapter. It's mentioned elsewhere in the draft. Perhaps it should come in here as well as being a fundamental component of that mainstreaming. In terms of calling for reform of the financial architecture globally, perhaps there could be a few more generic examples of what exactly that means. For example, getting MDBs to come on board in the ways that we think they need to, just to, again, give an internal signal and an external signal in terms of the types of things that we'd like to see. It talks about adaptation being an important focus. I think it would be good to add the climate resilience. I know those are very sort of similar terms, but I think the depth of what is meant by climate resilience might benefit from being highlighted. And then it's present here and there, but perhaps strengthening the issue of governance itself, the governance of the climate response as a whole, needing means of implementation as well. And I think that feeds into the point of this rollout of the Climate Change Act, and that needing to be sufficiently resourced. Chair, I think I will leave it at that. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Brandon. And I think that for someone who got a little bit ambushed into speaking, I think you've obviously read and thought about this document. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to now call on Zama Kanyile from business to make her input. Zama, over to you. Zama, I see you still muted. Is there, can I ask the Secretariat team, is there a problem with Zama's sound?
No, she's still on mute.
Zama, I don't know if you are struggling to unmute. We'll give you a minute. Otherwise, what I'm going to suggest is that we move on to Zahir Suleiman and then come back to the business input. So just let's give it sort of half a minute and see if Zama can unmute herself. Otherwise, we'll move on and come back to her input. Yeah, and maybe could I ask the Secretariat just to contact her and check whether there is a problem or not. Okay, this seems to be a webinar where we are ambushing people a little bit, but I'm sure, Zahir, that you are more than ready to make your input. So let me hand over to Zahir Suleiman from Gama, who is talking on behalf of the youth constituency. Thanks, Zahir.
Morning. Thank you, Chair. Just want to check that you can hear me.
I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much and good morning, everyone. My name is Zahir Suleiman. I am representing the Youth Caucus of the Presidential Climate Commission. I also work in climate communications. So today's webinar is quite interesting, especially because we're discussing implementation, because how can you really implement without young people? So I'm definitely not ambushed. I prepared a little bit for this webinar, but hopefully we can share some thoughts and observations on the draft recommendations on behalf of the youth constituency on how we can move forward with these draft recommendations. And if you see me looking off, of course, I'm just looking at my notes because I get nervous in front of a big crowd. But with that being said, I think to set the scene with regards to means of implementation, I think it is quite important to stress about the need for restorative justice and for climate justice. And we've seen that within these draft recommendations. And it's clear that the Presidential Climate Commission rightly recognizes this. And it's a signal of more ambitious, just, and climate resilient NDCs, because a climate goal without a delivery plan or without signaling all of these different visions is just a dream or a wish list per se. But to turn it into a reality, especially for young people, we have to look at these recommendations more holistically and see what we can discuss and how to take that further. So I'm going to start off by saying what we think the draft gets right, and where there is quite an apt description of how young people or civil society as a whole is regarded in the means of implementation. And I think specifically with the legal and strategic alignment, the NDC update is anchored in the Climate Change Act and the Just Transition Framework, which gives it a lot of regulatory strength and clarity. The recognition of systemic injustice, like I said earlier, where the draft recommendation boldly calls out the need to tackle structural inequality, and not just by cutting emissions, but by transforming the economy in ways that serve the most marginalized, including youth, women, and persons with disabilities. And there's a lot of institutional innovation, tools like the Climate Change Response Fund and the JTFM, which are a step forward, aiming to resource change at scale. And then there's a lot of emphasis on local delivery. Municipalities identified as key players in delivering climate action, which aligns with the need for community-based and youth-led solutions. And this sets the stage for credible and holistic climate response. But of course, we wouldn't be young people without saying that there's always more needed. There's always a change that can be made. And so what these might look like, specifically in the recommendations, is specific implementation pathways that sees civil society not just positioned as stakeholders per se, but also as implementers. Being able to mandate civil society participation, not just in consultation processes, but also in all forms, whole of society, NDC implementation programs going forward. Speaking to the recommendations around justice and inclusion. Also looking at specific dedicated mechanisms like youth climate programs embedded in municipalities and governments to support delivery and implementation. Jumping to finance, which is always the hot topic. I think whilst we've seen and the draft recommendations outlines the amount of money that was received within the last couple of years, it's clear that only a certain small amount of money was adaptation specific. And when it comes to youth and civil society at large, adaptation is far more important, especially in townships, rural areas, and informal economies, where sometimes this access to finance is almost non-existent without dedicated support windows or grant-based mechanisms. On skilling needs, whilst the means of implementation is focused on financial and technical support, something that is more deeply required in the recommendations is the need for capacity building, which we feel is quite lacking. Labor reform reskilling is mentioned, but we need further development. We need accelerators targeted at youth. Means of implementation needs to be expanded to TVET colleges and digital industries, and it should include more climate smart agriculture, renewable energy maintenance, ecological restoration, and green tech innovation, allowing for spaces for civil society to join through. And finally, monitoring must include us. I think the report calls for stronger monitoring, evaluation, and learning, but youth need a role here too, including more specific scorecards that is developed by young people to track MOI delivery on jobs, financial access, and justice. Looking at what makes this plan feasible, I think, as mentioned, we have the Climate Change Act and the Just Transition Framework. So we definitely see that the recommendations, the emissions range is supported by updated national modeling. And one thing in particular that is looked favorably upon is the no regret pathway. So we're still looking at our fair share for 1.5. And instruments like the low emissions development strategies, the sets, and the AAR framework provide technical assistance. But some of those implementation constraints are municipal capacity gaps, where local governments are pivotal but are underfunded, lack technical expertise, and face high turnover. We obviously know we need the call for further international climate finance, which we've seen at previous COPs and some of the international spaces, but our NDCs really need to push forward on this. We received our adaptation specific funding, but it's far below the $3 or $4 billion annual need that is required by South Africa. And despite mentions of inclusivity, we need more structured mechanisms to ensure that young people are mentioned throughout the NDCs. So we commend the PCC for including stakeholders in part of these draft recommendations. But I think what can take this a step further is actually calling upon the DFFE and calling upon the relative parties to not just only include young people as stakeholders, but we need to see NDCs where language specifically mentions the commitment to youth and children as implementers for change, and the need to recognize young people and capacity building of young people as we go further into our NDC process. So I will hopefully end off with just a few recommendations and demands that I think are necessary from young people. And hopefully that didn't take up too much of the 10 minutes. But on finance, specifically, we're looking at action facilities and funds within the CCRF to implement climate budget tagging to track youth-directed spending so that we can ensure that young people are seen more clearly in how we monitor and track climate finance. Skilling in jobs, national green job pipelines for youth via climate-linked apprenticeships or priority sectors like clean energy, water, agriculture, biodiversity, and transport that is linked to how we expand the means of implementation. Institutionalizing youth roles in implementation programs and councils, and including youth in the MNE systems with real-time reporting tools. And finally, looking at local government support, funding youth-led community projects via local government, and train and place young people in municipalities to help with planning, mapping, and delivery. So to conclude, I think the draft NDC offers a bold vision, but vision without implementation or without young people will fall short. Because as the youth constituency is, as young South Africans, we don't want to be climate mascots, but rather climate implementers. And the means of implementation section of the NDC is a test of whether we'll be spoken to instead of just invested in. So hopefully we can get this right, and we appreciate the PCC for the continuous and rigorous stakeholder consultations that have taken place thus far, but hopefully we can see more direct and frank language about the inclusion of young people in the NDCs and how we can include this further. And I will end my speech off there and give it back to you, Chair. Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity once again for young people to be present in spaces like this. I hope that was insightful.
Thank you, Zahir. It certainly was. I mean, I really like and appreciate the emphasis on agency of young people and the fact that they need to become the youth are actors in the process and not just recipients. I think that is a very fundamental issue, the issue of agency. I understand that Zama is now able to participate, that whatever the glitch was has been sorted. So Zama, over to you to give a business perspective.
Unfortunately, Joanne, Zama is not in the meeting anymore.
She was. Okay. Has she dropped off? Okay. All right. Well, that is unfortunate. And unfortunate not to have a business perspective. I'm wondering if there's anyone in the participants kind of as we go into the discussion who might not be able to give some of that some of that perspective on the issues. But we'll have to move on. And let me now call, and I'm hoping he is in the room, on Mr. Enos Mbodi, who is the one of the Labour commissioners in the PCC, to give a Labour perspective.
Hello, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you fine.
Okay, firstly, I want to...
We can't see you. We've got a picture of a laptop on the screen. But there you are, fabulous. Okay,
Yeah.
over to you then, Mpoti. Wherever you
so
are,
much
looks very cold wherever you are.
Yeah, no, it is cold. It is cold. Look, firstly, thank you for the opportunity, but we must indicate our displeasure in getting the what you call the presentations after hours yesterday. It doesn't give us room to check with all the counterparts, all the people that we should check with, and make a solid input. This is not the first time that we are saying this, Chair. We have said that this before also, to say, look, you can't imagine that we are full-time commissioners and then just send something overnight. And in the morning, we should be able to have read and digested the whole of it. But be that as it may, let me indicate, firstly, let me start by saying the issues that talks to employment are very serious issues. And I do believe that we are talking very little about it. Actually, in the presentation, what I saw is all stakeholders agreed that employment, skilling, and things like that. And underneath, there was a sentence that was very troublesome that says leveraging on existing opportunities such as renewable energies, renewable energy technology. I think it's problematic after you would have said all stakeholders agree to mention that as a qualifying statement, that leveraging on opportunities such as renewable energy technology. And I want to say it becomes very apparent that we are doing a very thin job with regards to employment considerations. It's very, very important to read into the statistics and get worried about how much effort we put in money and not projects like employment consideration projects. I say this because our involvement as labor in the commission was connected to employment. It was through the presidential job summit that the idea of the commission cropped up. And our involvement is to make sure that the issues around jobs do not get mentioned in one liner and be an agreement that seems very pedestrian with nothing that shows the hardness of the work that should be done around employment consideration. I think a lot more should be said. Secondly, when you look at your investment plan, for instance, when the needs are being determined, the issue of skills in the past, JET IP received very less. And I think it is because of what we write up in our NDCs with regards to employment considerations. It doesn't look like we are putting effort in that. If somebody was to pick up the recommendations and go into the passage that talks of employment considerations, you will see how exposed and thin we are with regards to youth unemployment, for instance, which is staggering, way above 60%, and generally the issues of employment, and making sure that as we get new jobs, we do not get reckless as we transition to those new jobs. They should be a very, very strategic way of making sure that the NDCs are not only looking at the emission targets and whatnot, and not looking at what we center this around, which is people, which is our economy, making sure that it works within the context of our socio-economic imperatives. I think the other thing that I should mention is the fact that you have policy coherence is a very important aspect, and I know that some people disagree when we mention the issue of policy coherence. But I just want to draw your attention to the fact that a whole lot of the things that the NDCs should come up with are interconnected with the IRP document, which is just finalized. I think it is a week or a week and a half before this meeting. And also the other issues of your emission targets that has to do with DFFE, which have got nothing to do with directly related to what we're writing now. There are some agreements that have been made to suspend, and I'm looking for the right word here, to not, I would say to suspend the emission targets capping by up until 2030 to a certain extent in some of the power stations. This is interconnectedness of policies that we do not see. When somebody talks of renewable technologies, you think of Department of Science and Technology for innovation and research. You also think of your higher education department. You think of trade and industry talking to solidly to issues that pertains manufacturing, technology. Yeah. And I think if you do not have a way of solidifying the cohesion of all these policies, you end up not covering the ground as you should, and the NDC should cover the ground. With regards to finance, I think I would start by saying one of the things we should mention is the issue of grants, which are very, very important. Grants than loans, because in any way, the loans, and I was distracted a little bit with something that came up on the screen there. The grants than the loans, very, very important that the loans, even if it is concessional, it should not sink us into a crisis of having to repay these loans. And many people do not understand that the fact that they are dollarized, these loans are dollarized, even if you say it is concessional, it is depending on the performance of the rand against the dollar. And we should be careful to push the message of the grants, because it talks to the original idea of the Paris Agreement. And I am aware of the fact that the Paris Agreement has got some people who are withdrawing from it, which is another thing that our NDC document should consider, the issue of looking at the geopolitical power shifts, because that is very, very, very important. Let me go back a little bit to the part that talks of renewable and renewable technology. We don't have to talk about renewable technology as an ideology. This is a technology that is being produced, and there is a truth to the fact that Pacific Asia is the one that is leading the manufacture of these technologies. How to get in and be competitive in that, it's something that we need to talk about. We don't have to talk about it as an ideology that it is through the value chains, it is through this, because we need to be more pragmatic and practical than just a sentence. We should be able to point out in the policy direction that will help us to even get into the mix into the production of renewable technology without being undercut by the global leaders now that are in the Pacific Asia. So we can't talk about it as a line item, as a sentence, which is ideological. We need to be pragmatic, because Pacific Asia undercuts almost everybody. How do we win this? It's what is important. Let me end by saying, economic transformation, this, which we're talking about, talks about the new ways of doing the economy. Of course, you need some reforms to the economy, some transformation to the economy. For instance, your socially owned renewable sector for us makes sense in changing some ownership patterns. I'm sorry about that. Ownership patterns. And also showing that the people, wherever they are, they can group themselves together and play a role and be supported, so that the monies that we get as a country do not end up just simply going one way and not going to the other. I mean, we were trying to look at some of the monies that have since been received. If you look at your grant register, you would see even in how the money gets dispersed, it's problematic. The last time I checked, I saw that 24% is given to implementing agencies in the country, and 76% it's these partners countries giving to their own implementing agencies, which can explain why things are not reaching the ground, because there's nobody who knows the ground more than the implementing agencies in the country. I think these are some of the things that we should look at, because it is of no value to just keep on getting money, even if it has got a great focus. It should have trails that is leading to the marginalized, leading to the poor, making sure that there is protection of jobs and creation of jobs, there is skilling, there is upskilling, and I don't have to forget the fact that also that your informal sector gets support, because the informal sector is a one huge source of employment. So I think some of these things we should be able to see them. So the NDC recommendations should mirror our socio-economic challenges, even though it is talking of the ambitions. These ambitions should not be just to meet environmental targets. It should also look at the socio-economics and be able to manage it as we deal with the environment. Yeah, I think that will be it. Safe to say that it would have been very, very important for the business perspective to be had. And I say this because currently business is employing a whole lot of us. If they don't say something and we don't hear what they're saying, we don't know what is happening in their space. Because what we get to know in bargaining and in consultation is what they bring up and show us these are the changes that are coming. Even if it were that we also know, pick up some changes and some dynamic changes in the employment opportunities and considerations. They're the ones who know their sectors, who know not only the sector in the country, but also globally. They know how the markets are operating and how they are behaving. And if they don't say something here, yeah, it becomes worrisome. But the point that is very, very worrisome is that one of getting invited to a meeting overnight and getting put in a difficult position of having to magically put all the things that one is doing aside in order to make an input that is informed, having received the presentation overnight after hours. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Mr. Bodi. I'm going to, on behalf of any confusions, apologize and in fact suggest that there's further discussion bilaterally between you and the Secretariat in order to address that. But thank you for your input, made it short notice. I understand that Ms. Kanyile has now been able to sort out the problems that she was having with connectivity. I just got a message from the Secretariat. So can I please call on you, Zama, to make your input? I think that, as Mbodi said, it's important that we hear the business view.
Thank you, Joanne. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, we can both see and hear you. Great.
Fantastic. Thank you. And good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank, the PCC for this essential webinar And from a business standpoint, we see successful NDC implementation hinging on strong financial, technological, and capacity building support outlined in the means of implementation chapter of the updated NDC. In terms of financing the transition, the NDC targets a climate finance floor of about $8 billion per year by 2030, which is a crucial benchmark both domestically and internationally. And to support this, business is calling for concessional finance and risk reduction instruments that make these green projects commercially viable, and also stronger coordination between government DFIs like DBSA and private investors to scale blended finance solutions as well. In terms of leveraging domestic instruments, this chapter stresses mobilization via instruments like the JET IP, the CCRF, and the newly formed Climate Finance Facility. So business is urging for transparent governance, clear pipeline development, and timely disbursement of these tools. Also calling and urging for de-risking for the projects for private participation, particularly that of SMEs and cross-sector value chains. In terms of technology transfer and industrial capacity, access to climate technologies like renewable energy, storage, green hydrogen, etc., is identified as essential. And business therefore recommends targeted incentives like grants, tax breaks, etc., that are conditional on local manufacturing, skills transfer, and also local value creation. Business also recommends collaboration frameworks that link overseas OEMs with South African suppliers and technical institutions as well. From a capacity building and local readiness perspective, the NDC emphasizes building capacity across national and subnational levels, including local government monitoring and voluntary climate reporting. So from industry's perspective, support clinics and private public training platforms are needed for project origination, MRV compliance, and net zero decarbonization planning. Private sector expertise in digital tools should be leveraged to uplift nascent participants as well. From an equity and just transition alignment perspective, business echoes the means of implementation chapters, equity framing, mobilized finance, and tech must support a just transition and local industrial inclusion. We emphasize ensuring ensuring support regions reaches regions vulnerable to coal phase out through enterprise funds and reskilling programs, and investing in new industries and economic diversification for long-term sustainability. So in closing, business is ready to partner towards delivering a well-resourced and implementable NDC. We welcome regular business engagements on means of MOI implementation, transparent sharing of projects, pipelines linked to the JET IP, CCRF, and international funds, and co-designing frameworks to maximize private capital mobilization and industrial co-benefits. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much for that input, Zama. I think it was concise and touched on all of the key elements of the document. We are now going to play the audio input that we received from Francesca from the faith communities. And then we'll go on to the facilitated discussion. So can I ask the Secretariat to please play I can't hear anything. I can see she's talking. I don't have any.
My name is Thank you so much for the opportunity to present the perspective from the faith sector at this important webinar on means of implementation, or MRI. My name is Francesca De Gasperis from SAPSI. Yeah, I mean, we had a great session yesterday on mitigation. So what I wanted to do was talk about means of implementation in terms of mitigation and adaptation, recognizing that from our perspective, ambitious climate targets are meaningless without a robust, just, and transparent way to achieve them. And with South Africa warming at twice the global average, we're currently already seeing the kinds of climate shocks and disasters that need to be addressed through processes such as the means of implementation. And there's been quite a lot of critique about means of implementation, that they don't go far enough. And obviously the issues that we face elsewhere with lack of funding and adaptation, and some of the lack of policy coherence in mitigation, mean that it's difficult for means of implementation to be ambitious and binding so that we don't pass 1.5 degrees, but this is very important. And I think at this juncture, I would like to just comment on some of the justice issues that we see in South Africa around the impacts of climate change hitting communities most vulnerable, but calling on South Africa to reduce its commitment to decarbonize and to meet its NDCs due to these kinds of historic inequalities. Actually would be, I believe, a really, it would not benefit those most vulnerable. In fact, it would potentially reduce our leadership in the UNFCCC negotiation process, which has been strong to date, and also reduce our ability to access some of the financial mechanisms. So, it would make us a less attractive partner. And as we are part of the first Just Transition Investment Partnership, it's really important that we don't jeopardize what funding that is coming in to support community initiatives for energy, for adaptation, and to build resilience. So yeah, I would say we know the issues with the just energy transition, issues of finance being given by loan, and a lot of the issues around means of implementation refer to things like the financial resources that are available, the way we can receive technological development and transfer of technology, as well as capacity building in country for us to effectively implement the Paris Agreement under our NDCs. So yeah, I mean, this is all about the Paris Agreement, which was 10 years old now. And in the Paris Agreement, Articles 9, 10, and 11 really look at this issue of means of implementation. So it's the financial, technological, and capacity building support needed for adaptation and mitigation. But really, there's aspects within MRI which are looking at equity and differentiated responsibilities, which is sort of a bit more of the technical language, but really referring to what I said earlier about South Africa having a differentiated responsibility, but needing to be a leader and go beyond and make sure that our emissions are low, and not due to poor planning or poor economy development, but really around us being ambitious and showing we can do this. There's been a lot invested in South Africa with the JET plan, but unfortunately we need much, much more money, and finance is probably the biggest sticking point, I would say, in this space. Looking for more finance, there's not enough money to go around. Developed countries aren't pledging enough, and so being creative in that space, while from our perspective in terms of justice, we really need to see better grant making We need to see grant making that's intentional around helping communities to adapt and, where possible, to mitigate. But I think adaptation in the South African context is really, really important, and we shouldn't underemphasize that, especially within means of implementation. So yeah, I think moving away from the mainly loan-based funds that we've received is absolutely critical for means of implementation. And then we really do need to track the funds that we're receiving for adaptation in particular and track progress. We're not going to see progress unless we start really giving ourselves very clear targets and goals, and then we track these in a transparent way. And as I said yesterday, this is a fantastic opportunity for communities to be involved. We should be using tech for citizen science, for citizen engagement. There's so many interesting ways nowadays that we can really reach each other much more easily than in the past. And I think we're not doing enough in this particular area for us to really know what implementation means. Yes, the financial flows are important to track, but we also need to be very clear about what we're trying to achieve and then really track it. And yeah, we need to have that both for adaptation and mitigation. As I said, this will also help us by having these targets, by having these plans. It will help us to argue, to encourage more funding, to argue, to say, look, we're doing this well. But when we're doing this process and when we get into this highly technical language, it really needs to be accessible. It needs to be made, the language of climate change also needs to be the language that we use in our community. So some harmonization around terms, making sure we're fully transparent, as I said, that allows communities to engage. And we want to see a dashboard really tracking financial flows. This is always an area of great opaqueness, disclosure on where the money is coming from, disclosure on who's doing the projects to help us improve our accountability. And yeah, so indicators are very, very important. How do we look at what it is that we're trying to achieve? We need more information about gender, vulnerability reduction, participation. We need to report on it, and we need to make sure that capacity building is central to means of implementation. So yeah, if we are not able to adapt, then we're not going to achieve our goals, and we will continue to see very serious climate shocks impacts, especially in rural parts of South Africa. And I think if we get this right with the way that we're measuring and sharing information, that can be done domestically, it can be done nationally, and it can be done internationally. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this area. I think local governments are absolutely critical, but always not to leave out civil society and community groups. And especially from our perspective, the faith sector, it's really important that we see the power and role and leadership that faith play in helping to inform communities and helping to make sure that we're all on the same page and helping to make sure that we make this really a transformative opportunity rather than getting too bogged down in the sort of mechanisms of finance. That should not be our focus. Our focus in MOI needs to be on making sure that we really do build climate resilience. And that needs to be held locally as well. There needs to be great ways that we can capture the data, as I said. And I mean, this is a really interesting topic. So I feel that there's much more that needs to be said and learned around it. And I'm sorry that I'm not there to learn with you all today and hear what others have been saying, but I look forward to reading the report. And thank you so much to the PCC and all of you for making these opportunities possible for us to try and unpack, demystify, understand better what is the challenge of climate change and what is it that we as a society need to do to respond effectively. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your meeting.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that input. I think echoing quite a lot of what some of the other panelists have said. We are now going to move on to we've got exactly half an hour for input from the floor. I see that on the Q&A, there have been a number of questions that have been posted, and Kwesi has been answering them. And we will now open up. So if anybody, firstly, let me ask, is there anybody in the panel who wants to respond to anything that has been said before we open up to the floor? The way I want to suggest that we do this is that we take 4 or 5 questions or comments. Please keep them short. Please don't repeat what others have said. And then what we'll do is to give the panelists an opportunity to come back and make very, very brief closing comments or respond to issues that have been raised. And then I will hand over to the PCC's Executive Director, Ms. Dora Modise, to close and to make closing comments. Thank you. Okay. Can we get an indication of who would want to come in? Would anybody who's posted questions or comments want to speak to those? And I think most importantly of all, what is your response to the PCC's recommendations on means of implementation? Is there anything that has been left out? Is there anything that should be have greater emphasis? Is there anything completely new that needs to go in? Okay, I see from Tebogo. I'd like to raise a question and comment. Secretariat, can you enable people to speak or not? Can I get some guidance?
I am unmuted.
Okay. Go ahead, Tebogo.
Thank you. Good morning. Tebogo Soeping here. Running a newly founded NPC that focuses on food security, climate action awareness at grassroots levels, including how young people and young women particularly can be integrated meaningfully into the just transition. So I just want to appreciate the work that's been done and the presentation. I think the commitment and consistency will reap the rewards in the longer term. I think it's important for us to have continuous conversations. But as this platform provides, is where are the actions? What would we be able to point back at as a country 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the line to say, you know, this is where the work sits primarily at localized levels. So for me is how do we make sure that the NDC incorporates tangible actions of localizing the things that we speak of as part of the framework, because there is a great detachment between the people and the processes that are taking place and the conversations that are happening. We are seeing that climate issues do affect ordinary citizens in their ordinary lives. The floods in the schools that are taking place at community levels, how do we empower and equip communities to be able to have also individual actions that contribute to adaptation and mitigation? So how does the PCC as part of this implementation process also help towards developing a toolkit of some sorts, you know, that creates both awareness and some of the simple to do actions? And also, very importantly, how do we make sure that these things do reach the ground? I do know that resources and funding are an issue, but it isn't the reason that we should continue to leave that out. One of the other key aspects is curricular reform at both basic and higher education levels. Where are these conversations taking place? It is important as part of the reskilling and upskilling process to make sure that we're not being reactive at the end, the unemployment numbers are telling us that we have a huge crisis already outside of the impact of climate change and AI and technology, et cetera, et cetera. So we are on the back foot as a country already. So what can we do to make sure that the next generation over the next decade is not having to face the same impact as the one does? And just lastly, I think there's also, okay, I have two issues. Second last one is the G20. How is the PCC leveraging this platform and process as part of having key role players in the room? We have a Paris Agreement. How can we come up with a South Africa agreement for that so people can commit? We are stating what it is that we would like to see from people. And also, what are the ways in which to bring ordinary key role players who are in this process as part of the platforms that can be created within the G20, the policymakers, the grassroots organizations, and so that it also does not become an elitist process. And I'm saying this because you can only take so many people to COP. But how about bringing COP to us, because we have a G20 this year in South Africa? I'm probably leaving out a lot, but just for the sake of time, I do think that we must have a human-centered development approach. The tactics of the people are just as important as the framework and the legislation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tebogo. And I think that the issues that you're raising, as you say at the end, we're talking about a human-centered development approach, and what does that mean in a climate context? Yeah. So I think that's an important point. Is there anybody else who would like to come in at this point?
Joan, we have a hand from Clement.
Okay, Clement, can you come in?
Good afternoon. Am I audible enough?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you clearly.
Okay, my name is Clement Mepudi from Grassroots for Climate Action in Gauteng. Me, I'm representing the civil society, the grassroots community and the vulnerable. I thought today we are going to at least explain the key aspects of the means of implementation. You see, I'm supporting Comrade Commissioner Mbodi by saying we have to take this serious because it's our future plans and it's our climate goal plans. We don't have to be excited due to funding from the overseas or international partners. But we have to look of the article number 9. Article number 9 is talking about finance from the Paris Agreement, you know, and article number 10 is talking about technology. And article number 11 is talking about capacity building. Article number 9 is clear and it's obviously it must provide the international, the emitters. We have to be straight. The finance, that's why Comrade Mbodi said the business must come in. We are not coming with issues here. We are coming with solutions and ideas because we have all the transition goal that we have to achieve. All of globally, we have to achieve this goal. But article number 9 says the countries that are developed must provide financial resources to developing countries like us. They must help us to mitigate the greenhouse emissions. They must help us to adjust the impact of climate change. Article number 10 says technology must be transferred to us. Because even now, we don't know which technology, even our curriculum is outdated because we can't take our children to make the technology that is outdated. Working in the mines because you say you're gonna destroy the mines, you're gonna close the coal-fired mines. We have to give them the solar and the renewable technologies. And lastly, article number 11 is speaking about capacity building. Capacity building is needed, especially from the grassroots level, because now we are speaking here with English. There's no one here speaking in Zulu. All of us, we're speaking English. We are fortunate enough, we know English. But in other countries, they are speaking these NDCs with their own languages. They speak their NDC in Brazil. they speak, but we forced and we make difficult for the poor communities, those we say are vulnerable, we're speaking English. The capacity building must start from us as South African. We must change the institutional, our systematic and individual capacity to address climate change. That's why I'm alluding, saying we must know the core of the means of implementation. Is the tools for us to support and to address the climate change. We don't have to mix the just energy transition, because already we have seen the grants register. There's no transparency, there's no accountability. You know, we don't want to call names. Even the Minister of DFFE, he have allowed all the emitters like ESCOM and SASOL emit until 2035. Now for us, we are still looking at it as the grassroots community, that it's unfair for the minister. That's why he don't attend. Even now, there's no one from DFFE. You can even now call anyone from DFFE, no one from DFFE. They are waiting for PCC to do them their job, but we are looking for it. They are lefting us behind. Thank you for that. Thanks, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Clement. And I think in particular, thanks for the very specific comments that you made about the different elements of the document. Who is next on the line to come in? I also see that they're okay. Kwesi, I think, is responding to the comments on the chat. Can I ask the Secretariat, is there anyone else whose hand is up who'd like to? I see there are a total of 65 people on the line.
We have Richard Worthington. He had 3 questions in the chat, in the Q&A. I think he would like to speak on them.
Okay. All right, Richard, you can come in.
Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity. Yeah, maybe just to elaborate on one of the questions in the Q&A. Given that this is a section of our nationally determined contribution that does address the bigger financial system dynamics, I'm just wondering if it is seen by the PCC or some social partners in South Africa as an opportunity to explore that to some extent, given that we can keep emphasizing the need for grants, especially for things which have long-term dispersed. We want inclusive economic growth, but in the process of being inclusive, you don't immediately get a return on spending. So this whole question of how funds are available and whether it's only a question of grants or loans or whether we need some other kind of architecture, it seems to me this is an opportunity to at least speak to that to some extent. I realize this overlaps a bit with the G20 agenda, but after all, we do this on a 5-year cycle, and the means of implementation are severely compromised by a lot of the dynamics of our global financial architecture. And it does seem like an opportunity to give some recognition to that, some kind of impetus to efforts that are supposedly ongoing. So I guess I'll leave it at that. Oh, and just to highlight that one of the things that seems to me absolutely needs to feature is the opportunity for building the foundations for inclusive socio-economic development through decentralized development of electricity provision. Because there's so many synergies between enabling adaptation. The mitigation component is not when it comes to decentralized use of small scale with social ownership, doing this through local integrated development planning. The benefits are primarily in building resilience and adaptation. The mitigation component is not really significant, and attempts to monetize that through carbon trading or whatever haven't particularly helped. So it does seem to me that it is essential that should be clearly recognized in the NDC. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard, for that. And I think your your point also in the chat about mitigation and adaptation and looking at the way they can leverage off each other in implementation is very important. So thanks for that. I mean, I'm not certain about the issues around, I mean, I think you're raising the question of innovative and new financing mechanisms. Yeah, and I'm not certain how far we can or can't take that conversation. Okay, who is next? I'm watching the time quite. I think let's take one more person and then go back to the panelists before we close. And in the meantime, keep on putting your issues into the Q&A.
And we have another question from Mpopalwana. It says, good morning, everyone. My questions are on implementation. The JED-IP has a time frame from 2023 to 2027. What is the current status of scope of the projects? Is South Africa on track of achieving the planned targets, as there has not been much evidence in communities at municipal level, particularly on solar and renewable energy rollout? I'm not sure if they would like to speak on it, but that's the question that they asked.
Okay. I think that's quite a specific question on the JET IP rather than on the NDC and its means of implementation. But do you want to speak to your issue in the context of the webinar subject?
Or you can unmute yourself and then speak on the question.
Okay. Okay, I don't think that doesn't look as though we are going to get that question spoken to. Is there anyone else whose hand is up? And I apologize, I can't see hands. So
we don't have any more hands, Joanne.
Okay. All right. I want to suggest then that we come back to the panel members. You have heard what you've seen what is on the chat and the responses to that, the concerns that people and the issues that people are raising who are participating in the webinar. You've heard the views of the other panelists. So I'm going to give you each a couple of minutes to make any closing comments or way forward recommendations to the PCC based on the content that has been spoken to. Shall we start with you, Brandon?
Thank you, Chair. I'll just come back to this issue of waiting for money that might never come from the global north. Not to be pessimistic, but just realistic. I think as a country, we need to be spending wisely on development anyway. Climate crisis aside, I think Tebogo really spoke about the existing vulnerabilities and challenges in a very clear way, and we need to be prioritizing expenditure on this human-centered well-being. And I think one of the reasons that doesn't happen is that the return of investment or return on investment as kind of defined by the traditional but perhaps outdated economic thinking is not attractive. It's the same reason that adaptation finance lags so much behind mitigation, because there's not money to be made in the way that we conventionally think about that. But if we did full cost accounting, if we brought in frameworks like the social cost of carbon, this would become radically different. You know, as we go down the road of this climate crisis, it's going to eventually make sense, even in rands and cents terms, that you leave the forest up rather than realize commercial benefit from cutting it down. So I don't think the collective consciousness is ready to read that in an NDC from any country. But if we can start to point the way and put signposts in the NDC that just says, we need to stop externalizing. And as we do full cost accounting, it's going to make more sense to invest in climate resilience, for example. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that's a very important point. In fact, both your points are very important. Thanks. I'm going to go through in the order that people spoke. So Zahir, do you want to come in and respond or address any of the issues that have been raised?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, once again. And I'll just speak to actually quite similarly to the point from the previous speaker around the finance, just to give a youth perspective and probably something a little bit more Gen Z. But it actually came up in a discussion that young people were invited to have about a month ago with the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, who's the advisor to Mr. Guterres around climate change and climate ambition. And speaking to this finance point, what young people raised, and they were quite specific and practical, especially when it comes to implementation, is that right now we're sitting in a society where adaptation, mitigation, implementation towards climate change is just not lucrative enough. And as young people, we're looking for pathways and we're looking for existing mechanisms that allow us to be capacitated, that allow us to join the fight, shall I say, quote unquote, to be able to ensure that we have the means and the science, the technology, and the knowledge and the resources to be able to implement what is necessary going forward with achieving 1.5, with getting more robust, ambitious NDCs, or just to be able to implement more grassroots level climate action. So I think what is needed, and specifically what we see, is we can't rely on international partners, we can't rely on the global north. We really do need a whole of society shift in terms of how we're looking at climate action. And I think that can be taken up, especially, I agree with the speaker Tebogo, who raised this about, you can't take that many people to COP, but you can bring that experience, you can bring that those sentiments to South Africa. So we need more whole of society shifts towards how do we make climate action lucrative, how do we make it accessible, easy to understand, and then use that and lead with that by example in terms of how we're going to implement. We're one of the few countries that is part of the just transition, and to be able to lead with that and to show our regional partners and to show the international community that this can be done because of the fact that stakeholders are consulted, climate action is accessible, it's done in different languages, youth are a part of the processes, and we have the mechanisms to get there that can really take us in the direction that we need. And hopefully, if not maybe for the 2035 NDCs, but hopefully for the next set, we can see something that's a little bit more ambitious. So I'd like to close out with that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And I think that's a great closeout. Can we go on, Zama? Is there anything that you would like to pick up on or respond to? Oh, sorry, it should be actually Bodi who comes in first. Is there anything you'd like to pick up on or respond to? And then we'll come back to Zama.
Yeah, thank you. No, I just think there is something that we cannot emphasize enough, is the issue that in South Africa, we've got a just transition framework. And when we talk NDC and its focus, it shouldn't move away from that focus. So in other words, I mean, the issue of centering everything around human beings and also focusing on the vulnerable societies, impacted societies, also focusing on the young people, also focusing on your informal sector, making sure that it is not money to deepen our crisis. Because if we don't look at this as human-centeredness, the approach should be human-centered. We can be technologically driven in such a way that we end up closing our eyes and ears to our socio-economic challenges. I just want to emphasize that point to say this NDC should not come as an idea of getting money that will deepen our crisis, but it should be to help us to reset our economy and make sure that we, in the period of 5 years, after we have sent this NDC, we should be able to point back at the results of not having deepened the crisis, but made better of the situation that we face currently. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I think that's a profound point, and I think that point about what is our overall approach to development and how does climate impact it is implicit in what you're raising. Zama.
Thanks, Joanne. I don't have any further reflections at this point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think that I think this has been a very useful and interesting set of responses to the PCC's document. And I am hoping that some of the points that have been made both by the panelists as well as by the audience can be, I suppose it's not about changing the recommendations, but I think points have been made that strengthen them, that emphasize them, that reinforce them. And I think that is very useful, as well as a couple of new issues that could potentially be included. So I am now going to step back. And thank you very much. Thank you all very much. And then hand over to Ms. Dora Modise, the Executive Director of the PCC, to discuss the way forward as well as to close the seminar. So thank you, everybody. Dora, over to you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Joanne, for the excellent facilitation, and thank you to the panelists also for the contributions and to the participants. Yes, for me, it's just been great to listen to the different inputs on the means of implementation draft chapter, I must stress, because as framed by Lebogang at the beginning of this webinar, these consultations are meant to enrich the recommendations that we put on the table for DFFE to consider. So it is not at all even a final document. We have noted a number of critical issues, and it's very clear that we need to tighten, especially elements of people centricity and ensuring that actually what we produce is readily digested and understood by people, but then also most importantly that the means of implementation need to lead to actual implementation. And we've noted those very direct questions around, yes, the NDC gets published and submitted, then what happens to implementation? So the role of the PCC in that instance as that of just social compacting, advising, and catalyzing action, working with and through government departments, relevant government departments that need to implement, but then also agencies and different stakeholders. So therefore, what then gets put on the table in terms of our emissions trajectory, our adaptation actions, and how we then get to implement what we will be putting our fingers on the pulse in terms of ensuring that the implementation happens and continuing with our work around tracking the actual implementation. Now, in terms of and I've noted, I think very strongly the finance issues, which I very much agree that, there is, at the moment where we are sitting with climate financing, we've relied quite a lot on bilateral and multilateral funds, most of them pledged through the UNFCCC process. Very much international flows are very much from north to south, one-sided, most of them. But what we've also noted is that there is a lot of funds locally, and the work that the PCC continues to do on tracking climate financial flows is showing us that there's a lot of local funds that we have not tapped into, and that we are not probably exploring enough in terms of the packaging, and we are doing that through our just transition finance mechanism work, but then also through what we call country platforms, coming up with a nationally designed financial platform for climate action that would leverage different sources of finance, including international finances, but then also leveraging on local finance through philanthropy and private financing as well. So a lot of work is happening there, and we'll be doing further consultations as we refine this piece of work. So in terms of the NDC itself, the full document is on our website for comments. So over and above this session, you are most welcome to submit your written comments. We have a closing date of the 23rd of June. Between then and the first week of July thereabout, we will be refining the documents based on the inputs. The DFFE, the government process, is also proceeding. DFFE has the draft document that we've submitted, so they've got a view of where we are going in terms of our recommendations, and we are going to be having some sit-down discussions, and I do believe the draft in the government system is being considered through cabinet for publication for publication for public comment, which might happen towards the end of this month. So that would then lead us to a colloquium in mid-July, wherein we would be finally launching and looking at the final recommendations in light of the draft that would already be out from the DFFE side. So the July colloquium will be giving us absolute certainty in terms of where we are going with this NDC recommendation, and we will be having all the inputs that would be in place. So this session concludes the 3 sessions we've had this week. And thank you very much to everyone that has taken part and given us their inputs. And we will hopefully meet again in July at the colloquium when we look at the final documentation. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. The webinar is adjourned. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.